Thank you. I'd like to start this presentation by pointing something out that may seem glaringly obvious. We have some serious problems going on. So, we can talk about them, and we have talked about them even here today. But increasing income disparity, for example, is a major social problem that we have that's affecting our communities, our country, even globally. Economic and demographic pressures. Here in Nova Scotia, we actually have a natural decline in population occurring, and so we're depending on immigration to have a robust population in Nova Scotia, robust enough to have a functional and a progressive economy. Part of our challenge, of course, is that the increasing diversity in the absence of increasing sense of community is creating some social tensions. We have the problem of poverty and homelessness in our communities. Here in Nova Scotia, and certainly here in Halifax, we hear about this with every impending fall, about the challenges that certain people are going to have during our difficult winters. We experience crime and violence in very disturbing patterns. As an African Nova Scotian, I can tell you that I've certainly been concerned about the level of extreme violence that we're seeing in our communities in recent years. And as has been already discussed here, we're seeing sexual violence. And in Nova Scotia, we've been talking about cyberbullying and cyber-facilitated bullying and sexual violence. We have some serious problems going on. And it's my belief that to make serious progress on these problems, we're going to need to have all hands on deck. We need to have every man, woman, and child to be fully engaged and healthy citizens who are pulling together to bring our collective efforts and our collective wisdom to address these serious problems. Now I'm going to point something else out that I think may be less glaringly obvious. That in our efforts to mobilize each other as citizens, boys and men are in bad shape. And I've included a few kind of some demographic data to assert this idea that boys and men are in a bad shape to be a part of this solution process. One of the indicators that men and boys aren't doing so well in our culture is that men die younger than women. The gap in the life expectancy between men and women has actually been decreasing in recent years, but it is still significant, which is an indicator that men are living stressful and difficult lives. Men and boys have much higher dropout rates than women. Though overall dropout rates have been declining in the last 20 years since we've been actually paying attention to this and developing programs in our societies and in our schools to address school dropout, though those rates have been declining, men still have a higher dropout rate than women. And you can imagine that in a society that is depending increasingly on education in order for us to be healthy and whole and significant contributors to our communities, that this means that men are losing ground. Men die by suicide at a rate that is 3 times higher than that of women. This is a very grim statistic, and much could be said about the reasons why people feel so desperate that taking their life may seem to be the way out. And we could certainly talk about the gendered nature of suicide and suicide attempts. But it still remains that men commit suicide at a rate 3 times higher than women. And if we look in other populations, for example, in our Aboriginal populations in Canada, the disparity is even greater, with men committing suicide at a rate of 5 or 6 times that of women. Another statistic that we don't think a lot about is that men make up about 90% of all persons who are incarcerated in juvenile and adult correctional facilities in Canada. This statistic not only suggests that men are experiencing significant problems, but that they may even be perceived as the perpetrators of some of the serious problems in our communities. I assert again for you that boys and men are in bad shape. But the other thing that is occurring to me more and more these days is that we seem to not have a clue as to how to help boys and men. This was something that I began to identify very early in my career. One of the first jobs I had as a young social work undergraduate practitioner was as a counselor for at-risk students in public schools. And so I was deployed in inner city junior high schools to address the at-risk student populations there. And surprise, surprise, the vast majority of the children that I worked with were boys. Boys who were, because of behavioral challenges or academic difficulties, or because of social challenges, either within the school community or at the community at large, these boys were at risk of not being academically successful. And so they ended up on my caseload. As an undergraduate social work practitioner, I also had a stint in child welfare. And one of the things I came to recognize was that men, or in some cases the absence of men, was part of the significant issues affecting the families that we were working with in child welfare. And not only were men, by their presence or absence, significantly part of the problem of these families, but it seemed to me that my colleagues had precious little ability, and in some cases, precious little interest to engage men in the process of solving the problems that addressed their families, that were alive in their families. This observation that boys and men are in serious trouble and that we don't have a clue as to how to address their needs led me on a very interesting journey. So I decided that I needed to go away and study and get a master's degree, which I did. I went to a university on the west coast of the US called Walla Walla University. It's a sister college of my undergraduate institution. But more than that, I wanted to go there so that I could work and study at the Washington State Penitentiary, which was just 3 miles away from the university. It's a place that houses all men. And men that I think in their experience represented a great deal of what I'll call our social failures. And so I went to Walla Walla and I worked at the special housing unit of the Washington State Penitentiary, and I worked with mentally disordered offenders, protective custody, and death row inmates. Thankfully, it was a uniquely American experience. And one of the things that I noticed there in doing the work that I do with men, really trying to help them stay well enough to be well managed in a state facility, was that I noticed that many of these men that I worked with, in fact, the vast majority of them, lived brutal and tragic lives. And I'm not just talking about their criminal activity that wound them up in a state penitentiary. I'm talking about their early lives. So as I would go to the file room and leaf through ancient history of some of the men I'd served, I would find that many of them were victims of abuse. Many of them were victims of sexual assaults. Many of them had experienced trauma and tragedy in their early life. I think that that's something that we don't talk enough about. the fact that men and boys can also be victims of some of the serious social problems that are facing us today. In fact, one of the things that I think we completely misread is that men and women suffer from experiences of intimate partner violence at about the same rate. This is something that is not a large part of our imaginations. Another fact is that men are much more frequently victims of sexual abuse than we once thought. And yet men report being victims of sexual abuse at a much lower rate than women do. And we all know that the reporting of sexual assaults is minimal to begin with. But men almost never report. This is seen in an interesting series of statistics that I'll just run through very quickly. So if we looked only at police reports of sexual assaults, we would be led to believe that women are sexually victimized at a rate that is 10 times that of men. If we looked at more general social surveys, like the General Social Survey that we have in Canada, God bless Statistics Canada, we would believe that women were sexually assaulted at a rate of 5 times that of men. But if you go to field researchers who are actively asking these questions in our communities and meeting with people and talking with them about their experiences, we'd come to understand that women experience sexual abuse at a rate twice that of men. This means that an awful lot of men in our communities are experiencing intimate partner violence and experiencing sexual abuse and sexual assault. Something that we don't talk an awful lot about. So that's why in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years of my career, I've been spending a significant amount of time thinking about these issues and trying to find locations and promote locations where the needs of men can be addressed. So 3 years ago, being prompted by a client of mine, I started a treatment group for male victims of sexual abuse, and we call it Man Talk. And it is a professionally supported group for men that meets twice a month and is a place for men to heal around these issues that aren't a large part of our public discourse. It's one of the reasons why I've been motivated to start a similar group for young men that we're calling Young Man Talk, so that boys and young men can also have a place where they can talk about these things. One of the things that the Men of Men Talk, where the average age is probably mid-40s, have said is, how can we change things in our communities so that boys don't have to be middle-aged men who are falling apart before they begin to address these issues? And I'm also beginning to have discussions with colleagues and with men in the community to develop treatment work for male victims of intimate partner violence. So, why am I doing this? Remember, I'm doing this because I believe to make progress on the social issues, in the social problems that we've been talking about even here today, we need to have all hands on deck. We need to have every person healthy and whole and connected to a community of people who are working on these issues together. And it's my belief that men, in many ways, are not ready to be part of that project. Addressing men's problems is key to engaging men as healthy, whole citizens, as partners in solving our shared social problems. We need to start taking a chance on men and boys. We need to start creating locations where men and boys can speak about their woundedness. We need to start taking a chance by providing the resources necessary for men and boys to be healed so that they can come to the table. We need to take a chance on men and boys so that men and boys can be the change that we need to see in the world. Thank you.